while every homesteader in Rockbridge County raced to raise balloon frame cabins. Before the first snow, a 42-year-old widow named Ingrid Larson was still digging in late September. The sound of her spade cutting through Dakota clay carried across the prairie in steady rhythm. 3 strokes, pause, 3 more. Her neighbors called it a grave. They called her a fool for burying herself alive. She excavated 12 feet by 16 feet into a south-facing hillside. Her 8-year-old daughter, Anna, measured the dimensions with a knotted rope, marked in 1-foot intervals, calling out numbers in Norwegian-accented English. Cottonwood posts lined the excavation. The roof timbers weighted in neat stacks, each piece numbered in chalk. 60 days later, when temperatures plunged to 42 degrees below zero and winds sustained at 35 miles per hour for 3 straight days, the balloon frame cabins went cold. Room temperatures crashed to 21 degrees by dawn. Children shivered under every blanket their mothers could pile. But that widow's grave coasted overnight at 48 degrees with no fire burning. What did Ingrid Larson understand about the ground beneath the frost line that everyone else had missed? And how did her buried dugout become the difference between survival and catastrophe when the Dakota blizzard of '87 tested every shelter to its breaking point? The answer lay in knowledge carried across an ocean, in a woman's refusal to let pride kill her child, and in the simple physics of Earth that holds steady at 50 degrees, while the surface world freezes solid. The morning of September 23, 1886, found Ingrid Larson knee-deep in excavation work, while her neighbors hammered together their final cabin walls. Frost had already painted the buffalo grass silver 3 mornings running. Freight wagons carried news of early snow 2 counties north. Every sensible homesteader was finishing their structures. 1-inch pine boards over 2x4 studs. Tar paper stretched tight. Cedar shingles, if cash allowed. The standard pattern called for a 16 by 20-foot footprint. Single wall construction. Completion in 14 to 21 days if the lumber hauled clean from the railhead 12 miles south. Ingrid kept digging. Her excavation measured precisely 12 feet by 16 feet, cut into a gentle slope that caught the low winter sun. She worked methodically, benching the sides in 2-foot steps to prevent cave-ins. The measurements matched drawings in a leather notebook she kept wrapped in oilcloth. The notebook had belonged to her father. The pages showed earth-sheltered construction techniques from western Norway, where turf roof sheds maintained steady temperatures through winters that lasted 7 months. The back wall descended 7 feet from grade level. The front wall stood only 3.5 feet below ground. A sloped floor plan that would shed moisture and maximize headroom without requiring timber she could not afford. Anna sat cross-legged at the excavation's edge, sketching her mother's work in a smaller notebook. The child had her father's blonde hair and her mother's precise hands. She drew the benched walls, the drainage swale, the position of each cottonwood post. At 8 years old, she already understood that knowledge written down was knowledge that survived. Ola Larson had not survived. The memory lived in Ingrid's muscles. Every thrust of the spade carried the weight of that January morning in 1885, when she'd found him in their cabin, the pot-belly stove, cold, his skin the color of old snow. The thermometer outside had read 32 degrees below zero. Inside it had measured 18 degrees. The fire had died at 4 in the morning. By 7, hypothermia had claimed him. the cabin they'd built together following Samuel Fletcher's catalog plans. The cabin with vertical walls and a peaked roof and a stone chimney that announced civilization from miles away. The cabin that had killed her husband because it could not hold heat when the fire went out. She'd burned that cabin to the ground in March, sold the claim for enough to file on new land. 160 acres, a quarter mile from where Ole lay buried. This time, she would build with the earth instead of on top of it. Her father had taught her in the mountain valleys above Bergen. Peter Halverson had been a master builder who understood that soil below the frost line held steady year-round 48 to 55 degrees, regardless of whether surface air reached 90 in July or dropped to 40 below in January. The earth itself functioned as a thermal battery, storing and releasing heat with the persistence of geological time. "Mama," Anna's voice pulled her from memory. "Mr. Fletcher is coming." The freight wagon appeared on the wagon road, pulled by a team of matched bays. Samuel Fletcher sat the driver's bench reins easy in his hands. He was 45 years old, successful, well-fed. His freight business supplied most homesteaders with lumber and hardware from the railhead. He carried catalog plans from Eastern lumber companies, standardized designs with precise cut lists and nail counts that transformed raw boards into weatherproof shelter in minimal time. He'd supplied the materials for the cabin that killed Ole. Fletcher pulled the team to a halt, 20 feet from the excavation. He studied the work without dismounting. His gaze moved from the benched walls to the drainage swale to the neat piles of earth flanking the site. "Mrs. Larson," his voice carried the careful politeness men used with women they considered damaged. "You're digging your own grave." Ingrid straightened. Soil streaked her work dress. Her hands showed the calluses of 3 weeks' excavation. She met Fletcher's eyes without speaking. "Ground stays wet down there," he continued. "Come spring thaw, you'll drown in your own cellar. I've got a standard cabin package. Boards, nails, paper, hardware, delivered for $47. 3 weeks' work with proper help, and you'll have something that looks like civilization." "No thank you, Mr. Fletcher." "Ma'am, I know you're grieving, but this isn't the way. A woman alone, no man to do the heavy work. You need a proper cabin before winter." Anna's pencil had stopped moving. The child watched her mother's face. "I have what I need," Ingrid said. "Good morning." Fletcher's jaw tightened. His freight business operated on narrow margins. Each dugout represented lost revenue, lumber that would not be sold, hardware that would not be needed. Every homesteader who learned to build with earth and cottonwood poles instead of pine boards threatened the economics that kept his family fed. He gathered the reins. When that hillside collapses, on you don't come asking for help digging out. The wagon moved on. Anna returned to her drawing. Ingrid returned to her spade. 3 strokes. Pause. 3 more. The rhythm of a woman who had learned that safety came from what you built with your own hands. By October 5th, the excavation had reached full depth. Ingrid's measurements showed the floor crowned, 1/2 inch from center to edges, encouraging any moisture to drain toward the perimeter. She'd cut a drainage swale 18 inches wide by 12 inches deep around the uphill perimeter, falling 1 inch per 8 feet to carry snowmelt and rain away from the structure. Below the floor, she'd laid a French drain system, 4 to 6 inches of fieldstone that would intercept groundwater before it reached the living space. The stones came from a creek bed 2 miles distant. She and Anna had hauled them in a borrowed handcart, 20 pounds at a time, over the course of 5 days. Wet ground steals heat. Her father's voice teaching a 10-year-old girl the principles that would save her life 30 years later. The cottonwood posts went in next. She'd selected them from creek bottoms, cut green, peeled smooth to prevent rot. Each post measured 6 to 7 inches in diameter. She set them at 24-inch centers along the excavated walls, extending from floor level to the planned roofline 7 feet above. Every post was scribed to fit the irregular earth wall behind it. She used an old draw knife for the work, shaving wood away in curls until each post seated perfectly against the clay. Then she chinked the gaps with stones and clay mixed with prairie grass, applying the mixture 1.5 inches thick to create an airtight seal. The work took her into late October. Her neighbors watched. Ezekiel Thistlewood stopped his wagon 3 times in 2 weeks. He was an Englishman, 40 years old, with the bearing of someone who'd left home to escape something he would not name. His wife, Prudence, rode beside him on the 3rd visit, their 4-year-old daughter, Abigail, asleep in the wagon bed. Mrs. Larson, Thistlewood's accent carried the careful diction of Yorkshire. My wife wishes to offer you Christian charity. Prudence Thistlewood was 38, handsome, in the severe way of women who believed suffering brought them closer to God. She looked at the dugout excavation the way she might look at a wound gone septic. We're holding a dinner Sunday next, Prudence said, after services, for those in need of community support. The words carried the particular sting of pity wrapped in righteousness. Thank you, Ingrid said. We have enough. Do you? Prudence's gaze moved to Anna, measuring the child's worn dress, her bare feet, despite the October cold. A woman alone, trying to do a man's work. It's not natural. It's not Christian. My husband is dead, Ingrid said quietly. Not my faith, not my hands. The Bible teaches proper roles. A woman's place is in the home, not digging in the dirt like some savage. Anna had stopped sketching. The child's face had gone still in the way children learned when they heard their mother insulted. Ingrid set down her tools. She walked to the wagon, stopping close enough that Prudence had to look up to meet her eyes. My daughter will have a home, Ingrid said. Warm in winter, dry in spring, built by hands that love her. If that offends your God, perhaps you should ask him why he made mothers willing to dig. She turned back to her work before Prudence could respond. The Thistlewoods did not stop again, but the story spread. Margaret Hayes recorded it in her daily ledger. She kept the general store and post office in a cabin at the crossroads, 3 miles from Ingrid's claim. Her records tracked temperature readings, freight deliveries, and the small dramas of frontier life, with the precision of a woman who understood that documentation mattered. She was 48 years old, unmarried. She'd come west in 1879 with a brother who died of cholera the first winter. On October 19th, she wrote, "The Norwegian widow's building herself a badger hole. Neighbors split on whether she's brave or mad. Prudence Thistlewood says mad. Prudence would." Margaret kept meticulous weather records. Her thermometer showed October temperatures already dropping below 0 at night. The barometric pressure readings showed unusual patterns. High-pressure systems building over Hudson Bay. Arctic air masses preparing to push south. She wrote warnings in her ledger that no one read but her. The Dakota winter of 1886 to 87 would be different. She could feel it in the morning air, see it in the way animals moved. The geese had flown south 3 weeks early. The buffalo had migrated earlier than any year she'd recorded. The earth knew what was coming. The roof construction began the last week of October. Ingrid laid cottonwood poles 7 to 8 inches in diameter, across the 12-foot width at 16 to 18-inch centers. The structural calculations lived in her father's notebook. Dead load of 30 to 40 pounds per square foot when dry, potentially 60 to 80 pounds when saturated with rain and supporting snow accumulation. The poles could handle it if properly sized and graded for knots and defects. She'd spent 2 days selecting the right timber, rejecting any piece with splits or rot. Over the poles, she laid brush and grass thatch 2 to 3 inches thick. Then, she began cutting sod blocks from the surrounding prairie. Each block measured roughly 6 inches thick by 12 inches wide by 18 inches long. She cut them with a spade, working the blade beneath the roots to keep the root systems intact. The roots would knit together into a living roof membrane, improving over time instead of deteriorating. Anna helped stack the blocks. The work was heavy for an 8-year-old, but the child never complained. She understood what was at stake: a warm home before winter, safety, survival. They laid the sod blocks grass-side down in overlapping courses like enormous shingles. Water would shed while the roots grew together. The living earth above would moderate temperature, hold heat in winter, keep cool in summer. By November 2nd, the final courses reached the roof peak. Samuel Fletcher made one last attempt at persuasion that afternoon. The first serious snow was already threatening. Dark clouds massed to the north. The wind had shifted, carrying the smell of distant ice. "Mrs. Larson," Fletcher didn't dismount this time, "I can still get you a cabin package. Delivered for $47. It's not too late." Ingrid was applying the final clay straw daub mixture to seal the wall joints. 1.5 inches thick, mixed to consistency, applied with hands that had done this work 100 times in her childhood. "I'm nearly finished," she said. "Finished digging your grave." Fletcher's frustration had burned through his polite veneer. "You think you're smarter than every man in this territory. We build cabins because cabins work. Your father might have built earth hovels in Norway, but this is Dakota. This is civilization. My father built homes that kept his family alive through winters that would kill everyone in Rockbridge County. You're a woman. You don't understand construction." Ingrid straightened. Clay streaked her arms to the elbows. She met Fletcher's eyes with the level gaze of someone who had nothing left to prove. "I understand that my husband died in a cabin you sold him. I understand that when the fire went out, the walls couldn't hold heat for 4 hours. I understand that the soil 4 feet down stays at 50 degrees all year. And 50 degrees is the difference between a child who lives and a child who doesn't." She turned back to her work. "I understand enough." Fletcher stared at her for a long moment. Then he snapped the reins and drove away. Anna watched him go. "Will we be warm, Mama?" "Yes, Elskling, we will be warm." The finishing work took another week. Ingrid sealed every joint with the clay straw mixture. She applied 2 coats of lime wash to the interior walls, hardening the surface and reflecting the pale winter light that would enter through the single south-facing window. The window itself measured 18 inches by 24 inches, positioned to catch the low arc of the winter sun. The floor was bare earth, crowned for drainage, packed smooth. Eventually, she would lay stones. For now, earth was enough. The door was cottonwood planks, joined with wooden pegs, hung on leather hinges. It fit tight in the frame. A wool blanket would hang behind it once cold weather set in, creating an airlock that would reduce infiltration by 20 to 30%. She built a small stone fireplace against the north wall. The chimney pipe penetrated the roof through a carefully sealed collar. The firebox was sized for efficiency, not show. It would burn 2 to 3 pounds of wood per hour to maintain comfort, compared to the 6 to 8 pounds required by the potbelly stoves in balloon frame cabins. On November 7th, they moved in. The structure looked exactly like what the neighbors had predicted, a grass-covered mound that resembled nothing so much as a burial site. Only the stovepipe, protruding from the sod roof in the recessed doorway, cut into the south slope, suggested human habitation. It violated every assumption about proper housing. That night, Ingrid lit the first fire. The flames caught quickly, drawing well through the properly sized chimney. The firelight reflected off the lime-washed walls, filling the space with gentle illumination. Anna sat cross-legged near the fire, still sketching in her notebook. The child drew the interior walls the way the roof poles crossed overhead the stone fireplace with its careful mortar work. "It's warm already," Anna said. Ingrid checked the thermometer she'd hung from a roof pole. The exterior temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero. Inside the dugout held 58 degrees, with a small fire, consuming perhaps 3 pounds of wood per hour. She added the measurements to her own notebook: temperature, time, fuel consumption, the documentation that would either validate her father's teachings or prove her a fool. By midnight, the outside temperature had dropped to 22 below. Inside, with the fire banked low, the dugout coasted at 54 degrees. Anna slept under a single wool blanket, comfortable and safe. Ingrid sat watching the fire burn down to coals. In the cabin that had killed Ole, this same temperature drop would have meant waking every 2 hours to add wood. It would have meant the constant anxiety of keeping the fire alive, the fear of what would happen if it died. Here, the earth itself provided the buffer. The thermal mass of soil surrounding 3 walls and the roof held steady at its year-round temperature of 48 to 55 degrees. That massive heat sink prevented rapid temperature swings. It gave her time. It gave her safety. It gave her daughter a chance to wake up warm. The test came in mid-November. Cold air pushed down from Canada, dropping temperatures to 18 below zero, with winds at 25 miles per hour. Ingrid tracked the performance hour by hour. The Thistlewood cabin, she learned from Margaret Hayes's records, consumed 7 pounds of wood per hour to maintain 60 degrees. When Ezekiel let the fire bank overnight, the interior dropped to 45 degrees in the 4 hours before dawn. The Weber family struggled even more. Heinrich Weber was 35 years old, a German immigrant with 3 children: Wilhelm, age 9, Friedrich, age 6, Liesel, age 4. His wife, Greta, 32, wrapped their children in every blanket they owned. Their hastily constructed cabin used single-wall construction without shingles. Heinrich burned wood continuously, but could barely keep the interior above 50 degrees. Ingrid's dugout held 59 degrees, with a fire consuming 2.5 pounds of wood per hour. When she let it die completely overnight, the temperature dropped only to 51 degrees by morning. The mathematics were irrefutable. Reducing exposed surface area by 60 to 80% meant proportional reductions in heat loss. The thermal mass effects created a system that could coast through the night without catastrophic failure. Margaret Hayes recorded the data in her ledger. She was a woman who believed in evidence. The numbers did not lie. On November 20th, she walked the 3 miles to Ingrid's dugout. The visit was Sunday morning. Most of the county was at Pastor Silas Goodwin's service. The pastor was 52 years old, a Methodist minister who had arrived in Dakota Territory with strong opinions about proper Christian conduct. Ingrid answered the door with Anna at her side. Both wore simple dresses. No coats, despite the 15-degree cold. "Mrs. Hayes." Ingrid's surprise showed. Margaret Hayes was not a woman who made social calls. "I've been tracking your temperatures," Margaret said, without preamble, "against the Thistlewoods and the Webers. The data is conclusive. Would you like to come in?" Margaret stepped into the dugout. The warmth hit her immediately. The space was smaller than a conventional cabin, but it felt larger somehow. The curved ceiling, the soft light reflecting off lime-washed walls, the steady, comfortable temperature that required no roaring fire. 58 degrees, Margaret said, reading the thermometer. "How much wood this morning?" 2 pounds over the last hour. Margaret pulled her own notebook from her coat pocket. She wrote the numbers down. Then she looked at Ingrid with the directness of a woman who had no time for pretense. "You were right," Margaret said, "and I'm documenting it. When this winter proves what I think it's going to prove, someone needs to have written down what happened." "What do you think is going to happen?" "I think the barometric readings I've been tracking suggest this will be a winter that kills people. I think the conventional cabins are going to fail. And I think you've built the only shelter in Rockbridge County that's actually going to keep someone alive when it matters." Anna had been listening quietly. Now she spoke her voice, small but clear. "Will other people die like Papa?" Margaret looked at the child, then at Ingrid. The weight of what they both understood settled in the space between them. "Not if their mothers are willing to dig," Margaret said. The warning came from an unexpected source. Late afternoon on November 25th, an old man appeared on the wagon road. He walked despite the cold. His gait showed his age, but his bearing suggested someone who had walked these prairies before wagon roads existed. Joseph Whitehorse was 70 years old, Lakota. He lived somewhere to the west, on land that had been Lakota Territory before it became Dakota Territory. He traded occasionally at Margaret's store. Otherwise, he kept to himself. He stopped at the edge of Ingrid's excavation, studying the completed dugout with eyes that had seen this kind of construction before. Ingrid emerged from the doorway. She'd learned enough to know that Joseph Whitehorse did not make casual visits. "Mr. Whitehorse?" He nodded. His gaze moved over the structure, taking in the drainage swale, the sod roof, the south-facing entrance. When he spoke, his English carried the careful precision of a second language learned well. "Your father taught you this?" It was not a question. "Yes. My grandfather built earth lodges. Same principles, different materials, but same understanding." He gestured toward the swale. "You cut the water path." "I did." "Good. Wet ground steals heat." He turned to look at the northern horizon. The sky there had taken on a peculiar quality. Not clouds exactly, something else. A density to the air that suggested massive weather systems, building beyond sight. "This winter will be hard," Joseph said. "The buffalo moved early, 3 weeks before normal. The geese flew south when my grandfather's calendar said they should still be feeding. The earth knows what's coming." How hard, he met her eyes. The kind of winter that makes people forget what they thought they knew about survival. The kind that proves who understood the land and who just lived on top of it. Anna had come to stand beside her mother. Joseph's gaze dropped to the child, and something in his expression softened. "You built for her," he said. "Yes." "Good. Keep her warm. When others come asking, and they will come. Remember that knowledge shared does not diminish, it multiplies." He turned to leave. Ingrid found herself speaking before she'd planned to. "Will you be safe?" Joseph Whitehorse looked back. A small smile crossed his weathered face. "I have lived 70 winters on these plains, Mrs. Larson. 40 of them in an earth lodge that my father built and his father before him. We will be fine." He walked away into the gathering dusk. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of snow that was still days away, but certain in its coming. Anna shivered despite the wool coat Ingrid had sewn from a blanket. "Mama, I'm cold." "Then let's go inside Elskling." They descended the few steps into the dugout. Ingrid closed the door behind them. The temperature inside held at 56 degrees. She added wood to the fire. Within minutes, it climbed to 59. Outside, the wind picked up. The prairie grass hissed against itself. The northern sky darkened to something that was not quite night, but suggested night was coming early this year. Ingrid opened her father's notebook. The pages showed construction techniques, thermal calculations, the accumulated wisdom of Norwegian builders who had faced winters that killed the unprepared. On the final page in her father's careful handwriting was a phrase in Norwegian, "Jorda liver aldri om varme." The earth never lies about warmth. She translated it for Anna, teaching her daughter the language of her grandfather's wisdom. Then she closed the notebook and set it aside. The work was done. The shelter was built. The winter was coming. And when it came, when the Dakota blizzard of '87 descended with its 42 below temperatures and its 35-mile-per-hour winds, when conventional cabins failed and children shivered and men's pride crumbled in the face of physics, they did not understand. When all of that happened, this dugout would prove that a widow digging in the dirt knew more about survival than every man who'd called her a fool. The fire burned steady. The earth held its heat. And in the growing darkness of late November 1886, a woman and her daughter sat warm in a grave that would save lives. The cold settled in with the permanence of a season that intended to stay. By the first week of December, Margaret Hayes's morning temperature readings showed a pattern that made her revise her winter predictions from bad to catastrophic. The barometric pressure continued its unusual behavior. High systems building over Hudson Bay, Arctic air masses coiling like springs waiting to release. She walked the county roads 3 times a week now, recording data from willing participants. The Thistlewoods, the Webbers, 3 other homesteading families scattered across the township, and Ingrid Larson, whose dugout had become the outlier in every calculation Margaret performed. On December 4th, outside air measured 12 below, with winds at 18 miles per hour. Margaret's data showed patterns that could not be argued away. Ezekiel Thistlewood's cabin required 6.5 pounds of wood per hour to maintain 62 degrees. The structure was well built by frontier standards. 1-inch pine boards, tar paper stretched tight, cedar shingles with proper overlap. Ezekiel was not a careless man. He'd followed Samuel Fletcher's catalog specifications exactly. His cabin still lost heat like a sieve. Margaret recorded the numbers in her careful handwriting. Interior temperature at dawn, 43 degrees, after banking the fire at 10 p.m. The stove had consumed roughly 1/4 cord of mixed cottonwood and oak over 24 hours. At current burn rates, the Thistlewoods would need 7 to 8 cords to make it through winter. At $3 per cord for delivered fuel That meant $21 to $24 in heating costs alone. For a family operating on a subsistence budget, with minimal cash income, those numbers represented genuine hardship. Heinrich's single-wall construction, without shingles, meant infiltration gaps that made temperature control nearly impossible. On the same December morning, Margaret found their interior at 38 degrees, despite continuous firing through the night. Greta had created a sleeping arrangement that broke Margaret's heart. The 3 children slept in a pile near the stove like puppies seeking warmth. Every blanket the family owned was piled on top of them. Greta and Heinrich took turns staying awake, feeding the fire every 45 minutes, monitoring the children for signs of dangerous cold. "We make it work," Greta said in heavily accented English. Her face showed the exhaustion of someone who had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in weeks. Margaret wrote down the numbers. Then she walked the quarter-mile to Ingrid Larsson's dugout. The contrast hit her before she even descended the steps to the entrance. No smoke poured from the chimney, just a thin wisp suggesting a banked fire barely alive. She knocked. Anna answered, her face bright, her feet bare on the packed earth floor. "Mrs. Hayes, Mama. Mrs. Hayes is here." Ingrid emerged from the back of the dugout, where she'd been working on something at a small table. She wore a simple wool dress, no shawl, no coat. Her face showed none of the drawn tension Margaret had seen on Greta Weber. "Come in," Ingrid said. "It's cold out there." Margaret descended into the dugout and felt the warmth envelop her like a physical thing. She checked the thermometer by habit, 58 degrees. The fire in the small stone fireplace was barely more than coals. "How much wood this morning?" Margaret asked. 2 pounds over the last 3 hours. Margaret did the mathematics in her head. 2 pounds in 3 hours, 16 pounds over 24 hours. Less than 1/4 the consumption rate of the Thistlewood cabin for nearly the same interior temperature. She wrote it down. Then she looked at Ingrid with something approaching awe. "Do you understand what you've done?" Ingrid glanced at Anna, who had returned to a book she was reading near the fire. The child could already read better than most adults in the county. "I've kept my daughter warm," Ingrid said quietly. "You've proven that everything we think we know about frontier housing is wrong." The word spread slowly, at first, the way truth spreads, when it contradicts comfortable assumptions. Samuel Fletcher heard about the temperature differentials from a homesteader who'd been comparing notes with Margaret Hayes. Fletcher dismissed it as measurement error. Women with thermometers, he suggested, were like monkeys with pocket watches. They might tell you numbers, but the numbers meant nothing. He said this to 4 men at Margaret's store on December 10th. Margaret was standing behind the counter at the time. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice carrying the particular chill of a woman who has spent 2 decades being underestimated. "I have been recording barometric pressure, temperature, and precipitation data for this county since 1879. The Army Signal Corps has cited my records in 3 separate weather studies. If you question my thermometer readings, I invite you to bring your own instrument and verify them yourself." Fletcher's face colored. "I didn't mean." "You meant exactly what you said. Now here are the facts. The Thistlewood cabin at 62 degrees interior consumes 6.5 pounds of wood per hour. The Weber cabin cannot maintain 50 degrees despite continuous firing. The Larsson dugout holds 58 degrees on 2 pounds per hour. Those are measurements, not opinions, not women's hysteria, measurements." One of the men present was Ezekiel Thistlewood. He'd come to purchase nails and had stayed for the conversation. Now he shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Hayes," he said carefully, Are you suggesting my cabin is insufficient? I'm suggesting that conventional construction is thermally inefficient compared to earth-sheltered design. The data is conclusive. But it's a hole in the ground, another man said, like an Indian earth lodge. The Lakota, Margaret said, survived on these plains for centuries before we arrived. Perhaps they understood something we don't. Fletcher gathered his purchases and left without further comment. But the conversation had been witnessed. The numbers had been spoken aloud. The seed of doubt had been planted. Prudence Thistlewood made her move on December 15th. She arrived at Ingrid's dugout in late afternoon, accompanied by two other women from the sparse community, Clara Henderson and Ruth Morrison, both wives of homesteaders, both members of Pastor Goodwin's congregation. Ingrid was outside splitting wood. Anna was helping stack the split pieces in a covered area beside the dugout entrance. The child's hands showed the roughness of work, but her face was bright. She was warm enough, fed enough, safe enough. Mrs. Larson, Prudence's voice carried across the frozen ground. Ingrid straightened the splitting maul in her hands. Mrs. Thistlewood. The three women approached. They wore their church clothes, dark dresses, proper bonnets, the uniform of women who believed their righteousness was visible in their clothing. "We've come as a delegation," Prudence said, "from the Ladies' Aid Society. I see. There's been talk about your living situation. Some of us feel it's inappropriate for a woman and child to be living like this, in a hole, like animals." Ingrid set the maul aside carefully. She brushed wood chips from her hands. When she spoke, her voice was level. "My daughter and I are warm, dry, and safe. What about that is inappropriate? It's not Christian," Clara Henderson said. The woman was 26, newly married, recently arrived from Pennsylvania. "A woman's place is in a proper home, under proper covering. This," she gestured at the dugout, "this is rebellion against natural order." Anna had stopped stacking wood. The child stood very still, her hands clenched at her sides. "Anna," Ingrid said quietly, "go inside and start the evening fire, please." "But Mama," inside Elskling. The child obeyed, but slowly, looking back at the three women with an expression that suggested she was memorizing their faces for future reference. When Anna had gone, Ingrid turned her full attention to her visitors. "My husband died in a proper home," she said. "He froze to death in a cabin with 4 walls, in a peaked roof, and everything the catalog said was civilized. I found him at 7 in the morning with frost on his eyelashes and his skin the color of old snow. So you'll forgive me if I'm not impressed by your definitions of proper." Prudence's mouth tightened. "We're trying to help you. By telling me I'm doing it wrong. By suggesting my daughter would be better off if I'd built the same kind of structure that killed her father. By offering you a place in the community," Ruth Morrison said. She was older than the others, 45, with the tired eyes of a woman who had buried 3 children. "You're isolated here. Alone. It's not healthy. I'm not alone. I have my daughter. I have my work. And when this winter proves what I think it's going to prove, I'll have the satisfaction of knowing I chose knowledge over pride." "Knowledge," Prudence's voice rose. "You learned this from your heathen father in Norway. That's not Christian knowledge. That's pagan earth worship." The words hung in the cold air. Ingrid looked at Prudence Thistlewood for a long moment. Then she picked up the splitting maul. "My heathen father kept his family alive through winters that would kill everyone in Rockbridge County in 3 days. His pagan earth worship is the reason my daughter will wake up warm tomorrow morning. Your Christian knowledge is the reason Greta Weber's children sleep in a pile like freezing animals. She placed another log on the chopping block. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. The earth doesn't care about my theology. It just cares whether I understand physics. The splitting maul came down. The log split clean. Prudence and her delegation left without another word. That night, Ingrid held Anna close by the fire. The child was crying, not from cold, but from the particular hurt that comes from hearing your mother insulted by people who claim to speak for God. Why do they hate us? Anna asked. Ingrid stroked her daughter's hair. The question deserved an honest answer. They don't hate us, Elskling. They're afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid that if I'm right, then they've been wrong. Afraid that if a woman can build something better than what their husbands built, then maybe the world isn't ordered the way they thought it was. People get angry when they're afraid. It's easier than admitting they're scared. But we're warm, Anna said. Doesn't that matter? It matters more than anything. And when the real cold comes, when it gets so cold that being right is the difference between living and dying, then what matters will become very clear. Outside, the wind had picked up. The mercury was falling fast. Margaret's morning reading would show 8 below zero by dawn. Inside the dugout, the temperature held steady at 57 degrees. The fire was banked low. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth did the work that the Thistlewood's potbelly stove could not do. It stored heat slowly and released it slowly, creating a buffer against the killing cold outside. Ingrid added the day's numbers to her notebook: temperature, fuel consumption, weather conditions, the documentation that would either save lives or be buried with her when the spring thaw came. She thought about Prudence Thistlewood's words: heathen, pagan, rebellion against natural order. Her father had taught her that natural order was physics, thermodynamics, the behavior of materials under stress. Everything else was just story. People told themselves to feel better about their ignorance. The earth below the frost line stayed at 50 degrees year-round. That was natural order. That was the truth that would outlast every sermon Pastor Silas Goodwin ever preached. December 20th brought conditions that separated adequate shelter from dangerous shelter. The thermometer dropped to 22 below overnight. Wind sustained at 28 miles per hour from the northwest. Margaret made her rounds early, starting before dawn. She found Heinrich Weber, awake, hollow-eyed, feeding his stove for the 15th time since midnight. Inside measured 41 degrees. Greta and the children huddled under blankets, so many layers deep that Margaret could barely see their faces. "How much wood left?" Margaret asked. Heinrich gestured to a pile that looked desperately small. "Maybe 1 more week if we burn like this. Then I must go cut more. In this cold, we have no choice." Margaret wrote it down. Then she walked to the Thistlewood cabin. Ezekiel answered her knock. His face showed the same exhaustion Margaret had seen on Heinrich. Inside measured 56 degrees, but the cost was visible in the depleted woodpile outside. "We're burning through our winter supply faster than planned," Ezekiel admitted. "If it stays this cold through January and February, we'll run short." "Have you considered?" Margaret began. "No," his voice was flat. "I will not ask the widow for help. I built my cabin according to proper specifications. It's a good cabin. It's a cold cabin. It's a civilized cabin." Margaret held his gaze. "Mr. Thistlewood, when your daughter is shivering despite 3 blankets, does civilization keep her warm?" He closed the door without answering. At Ingrid's dugout, Margaret found a different scene. Anna was at the table working on arithmetic problems from a book Ingrid had ordered through Margaret's store. The child wore a single dress, no shawl. Her feet were bare. The thermometer read 59 degrees. 2 pounds over the last 4 hours, Ingrid said before Margaret could ask. Margaret sat down heavily on the bench Ingrid had built along one wall. She was 48 years old. She had seen hard winters. But this one felt different. The barometric readings, the unusual cold coming so early, the way the animals had fled south weeks ahead of schedule. "It's going to get worse," Margaret said. "Much worse. I can feel it in the pressure readings." "I know. The Webbers will run out of wood. The Thistlewoods will run short. Other families I haven't even checked yet are probably in the same situation." Ingrid sat down beside her. Anna continued working on her arithmetic, but the child was listening. She was always listening. "When they come," Ingrid said quietly, "we'll help. You have space for maybe 6 extra people. There are 20-30 people in cabins that are going to fail. Then we'll fit 6, and we'll teach the others how to build properly for next year. If they survive this year." The words sat between them like a third presence. The mathematical reality of inadequate shelter meeting inadequate fuel supplies, meeting catastrophic cold. Anna spoke without looking up from her arithmetic. "Mama can teach them now, before it gets worse." Both women looked at the child. Anna's pencil moved across the slate in careful numbers. Her voice had been matter of fact. A simple solution to a simple problem. "No one will learn from me," Ingrid said gently. "I'm a woman. I'm Norwegian. I built in the dirt like a savage. They won't listen until they have no choice." "Then we wait," Margaret said. "Then we wait." Christmas came on a Saturday. Pastor Silas Goodwin held services in the Thistlewood cabin, the largest structure in the Luce community that passed for a congregation. 14 people crowded into the space. The stove roared hot, consuming wood at a rate that made Ezekiel wince every time he added a split log. Ingrid and Anna did not attend. They spent Christmas morning in the dugout, warm and quiet. Ingrid had made a small cake with precious sugar and dried apples. Anna had drawn a picture of their home, the earth-covered mound, the chimney, the south-facing door. She'd labeled it in careful letters, "Varmt hus," warm house. In the afternoon, someone knocked. Ingrid opened the door to find Joseph Whitehorse standing in the snow. He carried a bundle wrapped in canvas. "Mr. Whitehorse?" Ingrid's surprise was genuine. "Please come in." The old man descended into the dugout. He looked around with the same careful attention he'd shown on his first visit. Then he nodded satisfied. "You've done well." He held out the bundle. "Buffalo meat, smoked, for winter." Ingrid took it carefully. The weight was substantial. "This is too much. It is payment." "For what?" "For proving that the old ways work. When my people lived here, we knew the earth was a friend. Then the settlers came and built houses that fought the earth instead of working with it. They called us primitive. They called us savages. You built the old way. You proved it works. That is worth more than buffalo meat." He turned to Anna. "You are learning from your mother." "Yes, sir." "Good. Someday you will teach others. The knowledge will continue." He moved toward the door. Ingrid stopped him with a question. "Mr. Whitehorse, do you know what's coming this winter?" He paused. "My grandfather had a saying, 'When the buffalo run early and the geese fly south, in fear the sky is remembering the ice.' This winter, the sky is remembering something very old, very cold." "How cold?" "Cold enough that the difference between wisdom and pride will be measured in lives." He looked at her directly. "You have wisdom. Your neighbors have pride. When the ice comes, wisdom will save who it can. Pride will kill who it must. Then he was gone, climbing back into the December cold. Anna held the bundle of buffalo meat. Mama, what did he mean about the sky remembering? Ingrid closed the door. Outside, the wind was picking up again. The barometric pressure would be dropping. Margaret would record it in her ledger. The pattern would continue. I think he means that sometimes the weather does things we haven't seen before. Things so extreme we don't have recent memory of them. But the earth remembers. The animals remember. And if we're wise, we listen to what they're telling us. That night, the temperature dropped to 28 below zero. In the Thistlewood cabin, Ezekiel burned through another quarter cord of wood. In the Weber cabin, Heinrich contemplated the shrinking woodpile and wondered if his family would make it to spring. In the dugout, Ingrid banked the fire at 10 p.m. and went to sleep. At 2 a.m., with no fire burning, the interior measured 53 degrees. At 6 a.m., 51 degrees. Anna never woke. She never shivered. She slept warm and safe, while the earth held the temperature that would keep her alive. New Year's Day, 1887. Margaret Hayes began the year with a barometric reading that made her double-check her instrument. The pressure had dropped faster overnight than any decline she'd recorded in 8 years of systematic observation. She walked through brutally cold morning air to Ingrid's dugout. "Look at this," she said, showing Ingrid the numbers. "This is warning of a major system. Something big." Ingrid studied the figures. She'd learned to read weather data from watching Margaret work. The pattern was unmistakable. High pressure building to the north, low pressure approaching from the west. When they met, when those systems collided over the Dakota Territory. When? Ingrid asked. Soon. Days, maybe. A week at most. How bad? Margaret met her eyes. I don't know, but I've never seen readings like this. Not even close. That afternoon, Ingrid walked the quarter mile to the Thistlewood cabin. She knocked. Prudence answered, her face hardening when she saw who it was. "Mrs. Thistlewood," Ingrid said. "I'd like to speak with your husband. He's resting. This is important." Ezekiel appeared behind his wife. "I'm awake. What is it, Mrs. Larson?" Ingrid chose her words carefully. "Margaret Hayes has been tracking barometric pressure. The readings suggest a major storm system is approaching. Worse than anything we've seen this winter. I wanted you to know. If you need shelter, my door is open." Prudence's face flushed. "We have shelter. We have a proper Christian home." "I'm sure you do," Ingrid said quietly. "I'm just saying that if the storm is as bad as Margaret thinks, thermal mass matters more than theology." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "We'll be fine, Mrs. Larson. Thank you for your concern." Ingrid nodded. She'd done what she could. She walked back to her dugout through air so cold it burned her lungs. Anna was waiting. "Will they come, Mama, when it gets bad?" "I don't know, Elskling. Pride is a powerful thing. More powerful than wanting to be warm." Ingrid pulled her daughter close. "We'll find out." The temperature on January 10th, 31 below zero. The temperature on January 12th, 35 below. The temperature on January 15th, 38 below, with winds at 20 miles per hour. And still, the barometric pressure fell. Margaret's readings showed the system building. The high pressure over Hudson Bay, the collision course with Pacific moisture, the atmospheric conditions that would create something rare, something dangerous, something that would test every assumption about survival on the Dakota frontier. On the evening of January 17th, Ingrid stood outside her dugout and watched the northern sky. The clouds there had a peculiar quality. Dense, heavy, the color of old iron. The wind had a smell to it, like metal, like blood, like the particular scent that comes before something breaks. She went inside and checked her supplies. Wood stacked and dry, food stores adequate, water containers filled, the sleeping arrangements ready to expand if needed. Anna was already asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. Ingrid sat by the banked fire and opened her father's notebook one last time. The pages showed the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced killing cold and survived. On the final page, written in Norwegian, "When the storm comes, those who worked with the earth will live. Those who fought against it will learn." She closed the book. Tomorrow was January 18th, 1887. Tomorrow, the Dakota blizzard would arrive. And when it did, when the temperature dropped to 42 below zero, and the winds screamed at 35 miles per hour, and the conventional cabins failed, then everyone would learn which graves held death and which held life. The barometer in Margaret Hayes's store dropped so fast, she thought the instrument had broken. She tapped the glass. The needle continued its downward fall. In 8 years of systematic weather observation, she had never seen anything like it. 20 degrees above zero. Deceptively mild. Almost pleasant after the brutal cold of the previous week. Then the wind shifted. It came from the northwest with the suddenness of a door slamming shut. One moment, calm air. The next wind at 15 miles per hour. Then 20, then 25. Margaret watched the thermometer. 20 degrees, 18, 15. The mercury falling as fast as the barometric pressure. She closed the store, locked the door, walked the 3 miles to Ingrid Larsson's dugout as fast as the wind would let her. Ingrid was outside driving stakes into the ground around the dugout entrance. Anna held the stakes while her mother swung the mallet. They were creating windbreaks using canvas stretched between posts to deflect the coming storm. "It's here," Margaret said. "I know." Ingrid drove another stake. "How fast is it dropping?" 2 degrees every 15 minutes. If it continues at this rate, she didn't need to finish. They both understood the mathematics. 2 degrees every 15 minutes meant 8 degrees per hour. At that rate, by midnight, the temperature would be 30 below zero. By dawn, 40 below. "Get inside," Ingrid said. "Stay here tonight. Your cabin is too far." Margaret didn't argue. She descended into the dugout while Ingrid and Anna finished the windbreaks. By the time they came inside and secured the door, outside, air had dropped to 8 degrees above zero. The wind was screaming at 30 miles per hour. The Dakota blizzard of 87 had arrived. 6 o'clock in the evening. Margaret checked her pocket watch, then the thermometer. 8 below outside. Wind gusting to 45 miles per hour. Inside the dugout, 57 degrees, with Ingrid's fire consuming 3 pounds of wood per hour. The Thistlewood cabin, she knew from her documented patterns, would be at 58 degrees now, with Ezekiel feeding the stove every 20 minutes. 8 pounds per hour. Their wood supply, carefully calculated to last through February, disappearing at a rate that made mathematical sense only if you ignored what would happen tomorrow and the day after. In the Weber cabin, Heinrich would be burning wood as fast as he could split it. 49 degrees inside maybe. The small box stove, unable to keep pace with heat loss through walls that had never been designed for this kind of assault. Prudence Thistlewood watched her husband feed the fire for the 16th time in 4 hours. Their wood supply was shrinking before her eyes. The pile outside visible through the window, looking smaller every hour. "Ezekiel," she said quietly, "at this rate, we'll be fine." His voice was sharp, too sharp. the voice of a man trying to convince himself. Their daughter Abigail sat wrapped in blankets near the stove. The child was 4 years old. Her face was flushed from the stove's heat, but her feet, extending beyond the blanket's reach, looked pale. Prudence knelt beside her daughter, touched her feet. They were cold. Not dangerously cold yet, but cold enough to worry a mother who understood that 4-year-olds had less body mass to maintain temperature. "She needs another blanket," Prudence said. "We're using all the blankets." "Then she needs to be closer to the fire. Any closer, and she'll burn herself." Prudence looked at her husband, saw the fear he was trying to hide behind competence, saw the way his hands shook slightly as he added wood, saw the mathematical reality he wasn't ready to face. They were burning through their winter wood supply in a single night. 9 o'clock in the evening, 22 below, wind howling at 35, sustained, unrelenting. The Thistlewood cabin had consumed 1/4 cord of wood in the last 6 hours. Inside, measured 54 degrees, despite continuous firing. Air infiltration through nail holes and bore joints meant the cabin exchanged interior air more than once per hour. Every exchange meant warming incoming air that entered at 22 below zero. It was a fight they could not win. Ezekiel understood this now, watching his woodpile shrink. He'd done the calculations in his head. At current consumption, they'd be out of wood in 8 days, and the blizzard showed no signs of stopping. Prudence sat with Abigail in her lap, both wrapped in every blanket they owned. The child had stopped complaining about the cold. That scared Prudence more than complaints would have. Children who stopped complaining were children whose bodies were conserving energy, shutting down. "I'm going to bank the fire," Ezekiel said. "Try to stretch the wood." "Ezekiel, no. It's too cold. We don't have a choice. If we burn through everything tonight, what do we do tomorrow or the day after?" He banked the fire over Prudence's objections, covered the coals with ash, closed the damper to reduce airflow. Within 30 minutes, inside, air dropped to 48 degrees. Abigail began to shiver. 11 o'clock at night, in the dugout, Ingrid banked her fire as she did every night. The small flames disappeared beneath a layer of ash. The combustion slowed to nearly nothing. Anna was already asleep, comfortable, under a single wool blanket. Margaret sat at the table, writing in her notebook by the light of a single candle. "You're not worried?" Margaret asked. Ingrid checked the thermometer. 56 degrees. "About what?" "The fire going out. The fire's job is to boost temperature during waking hours. The Earth's job is to hold baseline overnight. 50 degrees from the thermal mass. 6 or 7 degrees from residual heat. That's all we need." Margaret wrote this down. Then she looked at Ingrid with something close to reverence. "You understand something no one else does." "I understand what my father taught me. That's all. It's everything." Outside, the wind howled. Outside air plunging toward 30 below. In conventional cabins across Rockbridge County, families huddled around dying fires and tried not to think about what would happen if the wood ran out. In the dugout, the temperature held steady. The thermal mass did its work. The earth that everyone else called a grave was proving to be the warmest shelter in the territory. 2:30 in the morning, January 19th. Ezekiel Thistlewood woke to interior air that had dropped to 41 degrees. The banked fire had gone out completely. The coals were dead. He rose from the bed, his breath visible in the dim light from the single window. His hands shook as he tried to restart the fire. The stove was cold, so cold that the metal had contracted, creating gaps in the firebox that prevented proper draft. He stuffed kindling into the firebox, struck a match. The flame caught, then died. The chimney was too cold, creating a backdraft that pulled smoke into the cabin instead of drawing it up. He tried again and again. Each failed attempt eating precious matches, wasting time, while the temperature continued to drop. 38 degrees, 36, 34. Prudence was awake now, holding Abigail. Ezekiel, the draft won't catch. The chimney's too cold. He tried a fourth time, a fifth. The kindling would catch burn for 30 seconds, then choke out from lack of draw. By 3:15, interior air had reached 32 degrees. Water in the wash basin showed a skin of ice. Frost was forming on the nail heads that protruded through the interior walls, and Abigail had stopped shivering. That was when Prudence understood. Children stopped shivering when their bodies could no longer generate heat, when hypothermia began its first stages, when the difference between cold and dying became a matter of hours, not days. She looked at her daughter's face. The child's lips had a bluish tint. Her skin was pale. Her breathing was shallow. Ezekiel, Prudence's voice was very quiet. We need to go. Go where the storm. We need to go to the widow's grave. The words hung in the frozen air. All of Prudence's righteousness, all of her Christian certainty about proper roles and natural order, all of her mockery of the woman who dug in the dirt like a savage. All of it meant nothing when her daughter's lips were turning blue. I won't beg help from that woman, Ezekiel said. Prudence looked at him, looked at their daughter, made a choice that would define the rest of her life. Then I will. 5:45 in the morning. 38 below outside. The wind had not stopped. Prudence Thistlewood wrapped Abigail in every blanket she could carry and walked a quarter mile through darkness and wind that tried to kill her. Ezekiel did not stop her. Pride kept him in the cabin, but it was a hollow victory. His daughter was leaving. His wife was leaving. And he was staying behind with his proper Christian home and his dying fire and his conviction that he was right. Prudence's hands were numb by the time she reached Ingrid's dugout. She could barely feel them well enough to knock, but she knocked, pounded on the door with the desperation of a mother who understood that minutes mattered. Ingrid opened the door to find Prudence Thistlewood standing in the pre-dawn darkness, frost on her eyebrows, her daughter's face barely visible in the cocoon of blankets. For 3 seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Prudence said the words that broke her. Please, Abigail, my husband won't. I'm sorry we mocked you. Ingrid stepped aside. Anna, get extra blankets. Mrs. Hayes, make room near the fire. Prudence stumbled down the steps into the dugout. The warmth hit her like a physical thing. 54 degrees, no roaring fire, no desperate wood consumption, just steady, impossible warmth that her proper Christian cabin could not provide. She unwrapped Abigail near the fire. The child's lips were definitely blue now. Her skin was clammy. She wasn't shivering. All the signs of first-stage hypothermia that Prudence had feared. Ingrid knelt beside them. When did she stop shivering? An hour ago, maybe more. Ingrid touched the child's forehead, her hands, her feet. Then she looked at Anna. Bring the spare blankets, the wool ones, and heat water on the fire. She turned to Margaret. We need to warm her slowly. Too fast, and we shock the system. Margaret was already heating water. Ingrid wrapped Abigail in dry wool blankets, holding the child close, using her own body heat as a gradual warming source. Anna brought a cup of warm, not hot water with a little sugar dissolved in it. Small sips, Ingrid said, just to get her core temperature up. Prudence watched this woman she'd called heathen and pagan save her daughter's life with competence that came from knowledge, not prayer. Watched her give orders with the quiet authority of someone who understood thermal physiology better than Prudence understood Scripture. After 20 minutes, Abigail's lips began to pink. After 40 minutes, she started to shiver. The shivering was good. It meant her body was fighting back, trying to generate heat. After an hour, the child opened her eyes. "Mama," Prudence broke. The tears came in great, wrenching sobs that she couldn't control. All her righteousness, all her judgment, all her certainty about proper roles and Christian order, it had nearly killed her daughter. And the woman she'd mocked had saved her. Ingrid said nothing. She simply held the blankets around Abigail and added a small amount of wood to the fire. The dugout temperature climbed to 57 degrees. Abigail fell asleep in the warmth, her breathing steady, now her color returning. Prudence looked at Ingrid through tears. "I'm sorry. God forgive me, I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize to me," Ingrid said quietly. "Apologize to your daughter. She's the one who nearly died because adults were too proud to learn." 7 o'clock in the morning, 40 below outside, wind at 30 miles per hour. The dugout now held 7 people: Ingrid, Anna, Margaret, Prudence, Abigail, and 2 more who arrived just after dawn. Ezekiel Thistlewood, his pride finally broken by the reality of a cabin that had dropped to 27 degrees inside. And Pastor Silas Goodwin, who appeared at the dugout entrance without apology, without explanation, simply saying, "The Lord sent me here." Ingrid looked at the man who had questioned her Christianity, her choices, her right to build as she saw fit. The pastor was 52 years old, 2 decades of preaching about proper Christian conduct. None of it had prepared him for this. "The Lord doesn't care who digs," Ingrid said. "Come in." The 7 people created crowding that tested every aspect of Ingrid's thermal management. The carbon dioxide levels required careful ventilation. She opened the floor intake an additional quarter turn, cracked the south window 1/4 inch, despite the brutal cold outside. The body heat from 7 people added roughly 1,200 BTU per hour to the space. The thermal mass absorbed it and redistributed it evenly. Inside air stabilized at 58 degrees, with only 15 pounds of wood added over 6 hours. Ezekiel Thistlewood sat against the wall, watching Ingrid manage the space with quiet competence. His daughter was alive. His wife was warming. His cabin, his proper civilized Christian cabin, had failed catastrophically. And this hole in the ground dug by a widow had succeeded. "How?" he asked finally. "How does this work?" Ingrid could have gloated, could have reminded him of every mocking word, could have thrown his pride back in his face. Instead, she pulled out her father's notebook. "The earth below the frost line stays at 50 degrees year-round," she said. "That's not magic, it's physics. This dugout has 3 walls and a roof surrounded by soil that doesn't change temperature. That thermal mass prevents rapid temperature swings. Your cabin has 4 walls and a roof exposed to air that changes 40 degrees in 6 hours. No amount of wood can compensate for that much surface area losing heat." She showed him the drawings, the measurements, the calculations her father had done decades ago in Norway. "Conventional construction fights the weather," she continued. "Earth-sheltered construction works with it. That's the difference." Ezekiel studied the notebook. His hands were still shaking slightly. "I could have killed my daughter. But you didn't. She's alive. Learn from it." 2 o'clock in the afternoon, January 19th. 42 below outside. Wind sustained at 35 miles per hour. These were conditions that killed people, that killed livestock, that froze the sap in trees until the trunks split with sounds like rifle shots. Someone knocked on the dugout door. Ingrid opened it to find Heinrich Weber standing there, holding his youngest daughter, Liesel, in his arms. The child was unconscious. Behind Heinrich stood Greta, supporting Wilhelm and Friedrich. All three children had the pale, clammy skin of hypothermia. Bitte, Heinrich said, German failing him in his desperation. Please, our cabin. We cannot. Inside, Ingrid said. Quickly, 5 more people. The dugout now held 12. Ingrid, Anna, Margaret, the 3 Thistlewoods, Pastor Goodwin, and the 5 Webers. 192 square feet. 12 people. Conditions that should have been unbearable. But inside air held at 57 degrees. Ingrid organized the space with the efficiency of someone who had planned for this possibility. The children near the fire for maximum warmth. The adults in rotation 6, sleeping 6, sitting to maximize space. The ventilation adjusted again to handle 12 people's carbon dioxide output. Greta Weber wept as her children warmed. Liesel regained consciousness after an hour. Wilhelm and Friedrich stopped their dangerous shivering and began the healthy shivering that meant recovery. Danke, Greta said over and over. Danke, danke. Ingrid heated buffalo stew from Joseph Whitehorse's gift. 12 people ate from a pot that had been meant for 2. The food was stretched thin, but it was hot. And it was there, and everyone ate. Heinrich Weber watched Ingrid work, watched how she managed the space, the heat, the people, watched a woman doing work he'd believed only men could do. You learned this from your father, he asked. Yes. Will you teach me? For next year, I want to build right. For my children. Ingrid looked at him, saw the genuine request. No pride, no mockery, just a father who wanted his children to survive. Yes, she said. I'll teach you. January 20th, 40 below. The wind did not stop. The dugout held 12 people through the second night of the blizzard, without catastrophic failure. Fuel consumption, 55 pounds of wood over 8 hours. Less than 2 conventional cabins would have consumed for the same number of people. The thermal mass was doing the majority of the work, with the fire providing only supplementary heat. Ezekiel Thistlewood had been taking notes. Now he sat with Ingrid's father's notebook, copying drawings, measurements, calculations. You're not going to try to stop me, he asked. Why would I? Knowledge doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies. Pastor Silas Goodwin had been silent for 2 days. Now he spoke, his voice carrying the careful tone of a man reconsidering deeply held beliefs. I said you were rebelling against natural order, Mrs. Larson. You did. I was wrong. This, he gestured at the dugout, the warmth, the 12 people alive, because of knowledge he'd called pagan. This is natural order, the earth providing for those wise enough to work with it instead of against it. Prudence Thistlewood was teaching Anna a card game. The 2 of them sat close to the fire, the woman who had mocked Ingrid for impropriety, now learning from Ingrid's daughter. The irony was not lost on anyone. Margaret was documenting everything. Temperature readings every 2 hours, fuel consumption, the number of people, the survival of children who would have died in conventional cabins. This changes everything, Margaret said. When people read this data, they won't believe it, Ingrid said. Not until they've experienced it themselves. Then we make sure they experience it. Next fall, we teach. We help families build properly. We share what works. Anna looked up from her card game. Will they listen, Mama? Ingrid thought about Prudence's desperate knock in the pre-dawn darkness, about Heinrich's plea in broken English, about Ezekiel copying drawings with shaking hands. They'll listen now, she said. January 22nd, 15 above outside. The wind shifted to the south, carrying the promise of thaw. The Dakota blizzard of '87 was releasing its grip. Margaret made assessment rounds through the county. The damage was catastrophic. The Thistlewood cabin had consumed 68% of its winter wood supply in 4 days. Structural damage from freeze-thaw cycling had split boards, opened gaps in the walls, destroyed flour and other food stores that had frozen solid. Repair costs $28, an impossible sum for a homesteading family. The Weber cabin was worse. 75% of wood gone. The structure barely habitable. Interior walls cracked from frost heave. They would have to rebuild completely before next winter. Other families, Margaret checked, showed similar devastation. Wood supplies depleted, food destroyed, children who survived but showed signs of cold injury that would affect them for months. And Ingrid's dugout showed 0 damage. 190 pounds of wood, consumed over 4 days for 12 people. No structural damage, no frozen food stores, no cold, injured children. The mathematics were irrefutable. Margaret wrote it all down, every number, every comparison, the documentation that would prove what Ingrid had known all along. March 1887. Prudence. Thistlewood was the first to ask for construction lessons. She came to Ingrid's dugout on a morning when the ground was beginning to thaw, carrying paper and a pencil. I want to learn, she said. Not for me, for Abigail. I want her to know that mothers can build. That knowledge has no gender. That survival doesn't care about propriety. Ingrid taught her, showed her the excavation techniques, the drainage systems, the structural calculations. Prudence took notes with the intensity of a woman who had learned that pride was dangerous and knowledge was life. By summer's end, 8 families had begun dugout construction. 3 of them led by widows who, like Ingrid, had lost husbands to conventional cabins and refused to let it happen again. Heinrich Weber's dugout was completed by October. Ezekiel Thistlewood built one as well, keeping his cabin as a workshop, but moving his family underground for winter. Samuel Fletcher adapted his business, started stocking stovepipes for dugouts instead of full cabin packages, sold lime for whitewash, glass for south-facing windows. He'd lost the lumber sales, but he'd gained something else, the knowledge that his business would survive if he adapted to what worked instead of insisting on what was traditional. Anna Larson, 8 years old, helped her mother teach construction techniques to families who had mocked them months before. The child measured with precision, calculated with accuracy, explained thermal mass effects in simple terms that farmers and homesteaders could understand. Years later, she would become a civil engineer, one of the first women in the profession. She would design bridges and buildings and water systems. But she would always say that she learned engineering in a dugout in Dakota Territory from a mother who understood that the earth never lied about warmth. Margaret Hayes's final ledger entry for the winter of 1886 to 87 was dated March 30th. Ingrid Larson proved nothing about women, she wrote. She proved that thermal mass has no opinion about who understands it. She proved that knowledge requires no gender survival, accepts no prejudice, and wisdom will always outlast pride. 12 people lived because one widow was willing to dig. 12 people learned because one woman was willing to teach. The Dakota blizzard of '87 killed livestock, destroyed crops, bankrupted families. But in Rockbridge County, every child survived. Because sometimes the difference between life and death is measured not in prayers or propriety, but in the simple physics of Earth that holds steady at 50 degrees while the surface world freezes solid. Ingrid built with the ground instead of on top of it, and in doing so, she bought time, because on the worst night of wintertime is the warmest thing you can own. Bonn. Epilogue. Ingrid Larson died in 1924 at the age of 80. Her dugout stood until 1951, long after conventional cabins from the same era had rotted and collapsed. Anna visited it one last time before the county filled it in, standing in the space where her mother had taught her that knowledge, not gender, determined survival. The techniques Ingrid taught spread across the northern plains. Earth-sheltered construction became common in areas where conventional housing had proven inadequate. Thousands of families survived winters they might not have survived otherwise. Today, sustainable architecture firms across America design earth-sheltered homes that use the same principles Ingrid's father taught her in Norway. 50% reduction in heating costs, 60 to 80% less energy consumption than conventional construction. The same thermal mass effects that kept Anna Larson warm in 1887, keeping modern families warm in the 21st century. Physics doesn't discriminate. Thermal mass operates the same for everyone who understands it. The Earth still holds steady at 50 degrees below the frost line. And wisdom, when shared freely, still multiplies instead of diminishing. On the coldest night of winter, that wisdom is still the warmest thing you can own.